The mist clung to the fjord like a burial shroud, thick and grey in the pre-dawn darkness. Along the rocky shore, longships sat beached like sleeping dragons, their carved prows gleaming wet with dew. But it wasn't the cold that made the captured Saxon warriors shiver in their bonds. It wasn't the bite of iron shackles around their wrists, or even the knowledge that they'd never see their homeland again. It was the sound. Low at first, like distant thunder rolling across the water. Then rising, building into something that seemed to shake the very stones beneath their feet. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, chanting in a language that sounded like wolves learning to speak. The Vikings were preparing for something. Something that made even their own warriors pause and touch the hammers hanging from their necks. From the largest tent came the sharp ring of steel being tested against stone. Not the casual scrape of maintenance, but the deliberate, rhythmic grinding of blades being honed to surgical sharpness. And beneath it all, that chanting grew louder, more urgent, until it seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of something ancient and hungry. The Saxons had heard whispers of this ritual in their own halls, stories dismissed as the ravings of madmen or the lies of cowards. But here, bound and helpless on this desolate shore, they were about to discover that some legends are born not from imagination, but from screams that echo across centuries. Welcome to Scandalous Pasts, where we uncover the darkest chapters history tried to bury. Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal practices ever recorded, a Viking ritual so horrifying that enemies would choose death over capture, and even hardened Norse warriors whispered its name with reverence and fear. Before we begin this descent into the shadows of the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our explorations into history's most shocking secrets. Now, steel yourself. The morning mist is lifting, and the ritual is about to begin. The Blood Eagle. When death became art, the ritual had a name that sounded almost poetic in Old Norse, Blr and the Blood Eagle. But poetry and horror have always been strange bedfellows in Viking culture, and this ceremony was their darkest masterpiece. It wasn't simply execution. It wasn't even torture in any conventional sense. It was transformation, the methodical conversion of a living enemy into a grotesque offering to the gods. The earliest accounts come from the sagas, those sprawling Norse narratives that blur the line between history and legend. The Orkneyinga saga tells of Thorfinar, Earl of Orkney, who captured his father's killer and promised him a death worthy of his crimes. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok describes how the sons of the legendary Viking hero performed the ritual on King Aella of Northumbria, the man who had thrown their father into a pit of venomous snakes. But the sagas, written centuries after the events they describe, might have been dismissed as medieval fiction if not for one chilling fact: archaeological evidence suggests the Blood Eagle was terrifyingly real. In 2019, researchers examining Viking Age remains in Dorset, England, found skeletal evidence of execution methods that matched the saga descriptions with disturbing precision. Rib bones showed signs of deliberate cutting from the spine outward. Vertebrae bore marks consistent with the systematic removal of organs. The dead, it seemed, were telling the same story as the ancient texts. The ritual itself was a masterclass in prolonged agony, designed not just to kill, but to break the spirit before the body followed. The victim was placed face down, often bound to prevent any movement that might disrupt the ceremony's precise choreography. What followed was a surgical nightmare that could last for hours. First came the initial cuts. Using a seiksa long, single-edged knife that every Viking warrior carried, the executioner would slice through the skin along either side of the spine. The cuts had to be perfect, deep enough to reach the ribs but careful not to puncture vital organs. Death was the goal, but not yet. Not for a long time yet. The skin was then peeled back like opening a book, exposing the gleaming white of the rib cage beneath. Here, the true artistry began. Each rib was carefully separated from the spine, cut through near the vertebrae but left attached to the sternum. The sound, a wet cracking that seemed to echo in the bones of everyone watching, was said to drive some witnesses to madness. But the Blood Eagle's most horrifying element was yet to come. With the rib cage opened like a pair of wings, the executioner would reach inside the still living victim and extract the lungs. These were then draped over the exposed ribs, creating the wings that gave the ritual its name. If performed correctly, the victim could remain conscious throughout, their final breaths drawn through organs that now decorated their own open back. The symbolism was as important as the suffering. Eagles were sacred to Odin, the All-Father, god of war and death. By transforming an enemy into this grotesque bird, the Vikings believed they were offering the most precious gift possible, a life taken in the most elaborate way imaginable. The victim's agony became a prayer, their screams a hymn to the gods of Asgard. Some accounts suggest that salt was rubbed into the wounds to prevent the victim from losing consciousness too quickly. Others describe how the ritual was timed to coincide with specific phases of the moon, or performed only on enemies who had shown particular courage in battle. The more worthy the foe, the more elaborate their transformation. The ritual's sacred theater, the blood eagle, was never performed in private. It was theater, sacred drama played out before an audience that understood its deeper meaning. The location mattered as much as the execution itself. Hilltops were preferred, places where the gods could see clearly. Beaches worked too, especially if the tide could carry away the blood, returning it to the sea that had brought the Vikings to their enemies' shores. The ceremony began long before the first cut. Preparations could take days, during which the victim was kept alive but weakened through controlled starvation and sleep deprivation. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was practical. A victim who was too strong might struggle and ruin the ritual's precision. Too weak, and they might die before the transformation was complete. The Vikings who performed the blood eagle weren't random warriors drunk on bloodlust. They were often jarls or kings, men of high status who had earned the right to offer such a gift to the gods. The ritual required not just stomach for violence, but genuine skill. One misplaced cut, one moment of hesitation, and the ceremony would fail. The victim would die too quickly, the offering would be incomplete, and the gods would be cheated of their due. Witnesses described a strange atmosphere during these events. The usual joking and boasting that accompanied Viking raids fell silent. Men who had laughed while burning monasteries stood solemn as church congregants. Even the victim's screams seemed to take on a different quality, not just pain, but something approaching the sacred. The ritual's timing was crucial. It had to be completed while the victim still lived, still breathed, still suffered. Death was the end point, but not the goal. The goal was transformation, the conversion of an enemy into an offering, a living creature into a symbol of divine power. When performed correctly, the victim's final breath would escape through lungs that had become wings, carrying their spirit directly to Odin's hall. Some sagas describe victims who remained conscious almost to the end, their eyes tracking the movements of their executioners, their lips moving in what might have been prayers or curses. Others tell of men who laughed as they died, claiming to see Valkyries descending to carry them to Valhalla. Whether these accounts reflect reality or the saga writer's sense of dramatic irony, they capture something essential about Viking culture, the belief that how one died mattered more than how one lived. The psychology of sacred violence. To understand the blood eagle, we must understand the Viking mind, a worldview where violence wasn't just acceptable but sacred, where the gods themselves were warriors, and where death in battle was the highest honor a man could achieve. This wasn't a culture that saw cruelty as inherently wrong. It was a culture that saw cruelty as potentially holy. The Vikings lived in a harsh world where survival often depended on the ability to inflict and endure suffering. Their gods reflected this reality. Odin hung himself from a tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain wisdom. Thor's strength came from his willingness to face giants and monsters in single combat. Even Balder, the most beloved of the gods, achieved his greatest fame through his death. In this context, the blood eagle wasn't an aberration, it was the logical extreme of a belief system that equated suffering with sanctity. The more elaborate the death, the more pleasing to the gods. The more pain the victim endured, the more valuable the offering became. It was a theology written in blood and bone, performed on stages of stone and sand. But the ritual served psychological purposes beyond religious devotion. It was a weapon of terror, designed to break the will of enemies before battles even began. Word of the Blood Eagle spread faster than Viking longships, carried by survivors and refugees who had witnessed its performance. Entire armies were said to have fled rather than face warriors who might subject them to such a fate. The ritual also served to bond Viking communities through shared transgression. Witnessing such extreme violence created a psychological barrier between the Vikings and their enemies, a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Men who had watched the Blood Eagle performed could never again see their foes as fully human. They had participated in something that transformed enemies into offerings, people into symbols. Even among the Vikings themselves, the Blood Eagle created hierarchies of honor and fear. Warriors who had performed the ritual gained status that went beyond mere military prowess. They had communed with the gods through violence, had offered the ultimate sacrifice, had transformed death into art. They were no longer just fighters, they were priests of a religion whose altar was the human body. The victims, more than just enemies, not everyone who fell into Viking hands faced the Blood Eagle. The ritual was reserved for specific types of victims, those whose deaths would carry particular meaning, whose suffering would resonate with divine power. Kings and jarls were preferred, men whose high status made their degradation more significant. Warriors who had shown exceptional courage in battle were also chosen, their bravery making them worthy offerings to Odin. The sagas tell us about some of these victims by name. King Aella of Northumbria, who had killed Ragnar Lothbrok, was perhaps the most famous. According to the saga of Ragnar's sons, Aella was captured after the great heathen army overran York in 867 AD. His death was not just revenge, it was a statement about the price of killing a legendary Viking hero. But the historical Aella's fate remains disputed. While the sagas describe his Blood Eagle in vivid detail, contemporary Anglo-Saxon chronicles make no mention of such a ritual. Some historians argue that the saga writers, writing centuries later, may have invented or embellished the story to add drama to their narratives. Others point to the archaeological evidence and argue that the silence of contemporary sources proves nothing. Who would want to record such horrors in detail? Another famous victim was Halfdan, son of King Harald Fairhair of Norway. According to the Orkneyinga saga, he was captured by Earl Torf and subjected to the Blood Eagle as revenge for the death of Einar's father. The saga describes how Halfdan's screams could be heard across the water, how his blood stained the rocks red, how his death satisfied the demands of honor and the gods alike. But victims weren't always royal. Sometimes the Blood Eagle was performed on captured priests, men whose Christian faith made their suffering particularly meaningful to the pagan Vikings. The ritual became a way of demonstrating the superiority of the Norse gods over the Christian God, proof that Odin was stronger than Christ, that the old ways were more powerful than the new. Archaeological evidence from mass graves in England and Ireland suggests that some Viking raids specifically targeted religious communities, not just for their wealth but for their symbolic value. Monks and priests found in these graves show signs of ritualistic violence that goes beyond simple execution. Bones bear marks consistent with prolonged torture, with careful cutting, with the kind of methodical violence that the Blood Eagle represented. The psychological impact on these victims cannot be overstated. Many were men of learning and faith, accustomed to contemplating mortality in abstract terms. To face the Blood Eagle was to confront death not as a theological concept but as a physical reality, to experience the systematic destruction of their own bodies while remaining conscious throughout. Some accounts describe victims who tried to bargain, offering gold or information in exchange for a quicker death. Others tell of men who cursed their captors, calling down divine vengeance even as their bodies were opened like books. A few describe victims who seemed to achieve a kind of transcendence, speaking prophecies or visions as their lives ebbed away. The ritual's evolution and variations. The Blood Eagle wasn't a static ceremony. Like all living traditions, it evolved over time, adapting to new circumstances and incorporating new elements. Early versions, described in the oldest sagas, were relatively simple, the basic cutting and lung extraction that formed the ritual's core. But as Viking culture became more sophisticated, so did their methods of sacred violence. By the 10th century, some accounts describe elaborate preparations that could last for weeks. Victims were kept in special pens, fed specific diets designed to purify their blood. Runes were carved into their skin, not deep enough to kill but deep enough to mark them as offerings to specific gods. Some were forced to participate in mock battles, their performance determining how elaborate their final transformation would be. The tools used in the ritual also evolved. Early blood eagles were performed with standard seekses and hunting knives. Later versions employed specialized instruments, curved blades designed specifically for separating ribs, hooks for extracting organs, even primitive surgical tools that allowed for more precise cutting. These implements were often blessed by Gothi, priests, and inscribed with runes invoking Odin's favor. Regional variations developed as the ritual spread throughout the Viking world. Icelandic versions emphasized the victim's genealogy, with executioners reciting the lineage of both victim and performer before beginning the ceremony. Danish variants incorporated elements of ship burial, with the victim's open body positioned as if sailing to the afterlife. Norwegian versions often included the burning of the victim's possessions, sending their worldly goods to accompany them to whatever fate awaited beyond death. Some of the most elaborate blood eagles were performed during major religious festivals, particularly during the blot ceremonies that marked seasonal transitions. The winter blot, held during the darkest days of the year, was said to require the most powerful offerings. Victims chosen for these occasions were often kept alive for months beforehand, their suffering prolonged to match the season's darkness. The ritual also adapted to incorporate Christian elements as Viking society gradually converted. Some later accounts describe blood eagles performed on apostates Vikings who had converted to Christianity and then returned to the old faith. These ceremonies took on additional meaning, becoming not just offerings to Odin but rejections of the Christian God, statements that the old ways remain stronger than the new. The witnesses, those who watched and remembered the blood eagle, was never performed in isolation. It required an audience, witnesses who could carry the story forward, spreading word of the ritual's power and the god's satisfaction. These witnesses came from all levels of Viking society: warriors who had earned the right to watch, thralls who were forced to observe, even enemy survivors who were deliberately spared to spread terror. The psychological impact on witnesses was profound and lasting. Many accounts describe men who were never the same after watching a blood eagle, warriors who became either more savage or more withdrawn, their worldview fundamentally altered by what they had seen. Some became devoted followers of whoever had performed the ritual, bound to them by shared transgression. Others fled Viking society entirely, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with their understanding of the world. The sagas preserve some of these witness accounts, filtered through centuries of oral tradition but retaining their essential horror. They describe the sounds, not just the victim's screams but the wet tearing of flesh, the crack of breaking bone, the whispered prayers of the executioner. They record the smells, blood and fear, and something else, something that witnesses struggled to name but never forgot. Children were sometimes forced to watch, part of their education in Viking values and the reality of divine power. These young witnesses often became the most devoted practitioners of the old ways, their childhood exposure to such extreme violence shaping their understanding of what it meant to be Viking. Some grew up to perform blood eagles themselves, continuing a tradition passed down through trauma and awe. But not all witnesses were Vikings. Captured enemies who survived raids often carried tales of the blood eagle back to their own people, spreading fear and horror throughout Christian Europe. These accounts, filtered through cultural and religious bias, may have exaggerated some details while missing others. But their core message was always the same: the Vikings possessed a capacity for cruelty that transcended normal human understanding. Some Christian chroniclers described the blood eagle as evidence of Viking paganism's inherent evil, proof that those who rejected Christ were capable of any atrocity. Others saw it as a divine punishment, God's way of testing Christian faith through the agency of pagan warriors. A few, writing centuries later, attempted to rationalize the ritual as a form of primitive justice, brutal but comprehensible within its cultural context. The archaeological evidence, bones don't lie. For centuries, the blood eagle existed primarily in the realm of saga and legend, its reality disputed by historians who questioned whether such elaborate cruelty could actually have been practiced. The sagas, after all, were written long after the Viking Age ended, by Christian authors who might have had reasons to exaggerate pagan brutality. Without physical evidence, the blood eagle remained a literary curiosity, horrifying but possibly fictional. That changed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as archaeologists began applying new techniques to Viking Age remains. Forensic analysis of skeletal material, previously limited to determining age and gender, became sophisticated enough to identify specific types of violence. And what they found was disturbing. The first clear evidence came from a mass grave near Weymouth, England, discovered in 2009. The site contained the remains of 54 young men, all apparently executed around 1000 AD. But these weren't simple beheadings or stabbings. The bones showed evidence of systematic torture, with cut marks that matched the saga descriptions of the blood eagle with chilling precision. Rib bones had been carefully separated from the spine, cut through near the vertebrae but left attached at the sternum. Vertebrae showed scoring consistent with the extraction of organs from the back. Most tellingly, the pattern of cuts suggested the victims had been alive during the process. The bones showed signs of healing that only occurs in living tissue. Similar evidence emerged from sites across the former Viking world. A burial ground in Orkney yielded remains showing identical cut patterns. Excavations in Ireland uncovered skeletons with rib damage that matched the archaeological signature of the blood eagle. Even sites in Scandinavia itself began revealing evidence of the ritual's practice on home soil. The forensic evidence painted a picture that was both more and less horrifying than the saga accounts. More horrifying because it proved the blood eagle was real, that human beings had actually subjected other human beings to such systematic cruelty. Less horrifying because the physical evidence suggested the victims probably died more quickly than the saga's claimed blood loss and shock would have rendered them unconscious long before the ritual's completion. But the archaeological record also revealed variations in the ritual that the sagas had missed. Some skeletons showed evidence of preliminary torture: broken fingers, damaged joints, cuts that had healed before the final execution. Others bore signs of drug use, possibly hallucinogens that might have altered the victim's perception of pain or the executioner's state of mind during the ceremony. The most disturbing discoveries came from sites where multiple blood eagles had apparently been performed simultaneously. Mass graves containing dozens of bodies, all showing the same pattern of ritualistic violence, suggested that the ceremony had sometimes been scaled up for special occasions. These weren't individual executions but mass offerings, entire groups of enemies transformed into grotesque birds for the gods' pleasure. The decline and transformation: the blood eagle didn't disappear overnight. As Viking society gradually converted to Christianity throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the ritual underwent a slow transformation, its religious significance fading while its practical applications as a tool of terror remained. Christian Vikings continued to perform modified versions of the ceremony, stripping away its pagan symbolism while retaining its psychological impact. Some of the last recorded blood eagles were performed during the civil wars that racked Scandinavia in the 12th century. Christian kings used the ritual against pagan holdouts, turning the Vikings' own weapon against them. The ceremony's meaning had inverted: instead of an offering to Odin, it became a punishment for those who refused to accept Christ. The ritual's decline coincided with broader changes in medieval warfare and justice. As European society became more centralized and legalistic, elaborate public executions gave way to simpler, more efficient methods of killing. The blood eagle required too much time, too much skill, too much ceremony for an age that valued bureaucratic efficiency over religious theater. But the blood eagle's influence outlasted its practice. The ritual had demonstrated the power of extreme violence to shape human behavior, to create bonds of loyalty and fear that transcended normal social relationships. Medieval rulers, even Christian ones, learned these lessons well. The elaborate public executions of the later Middle Ages, drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, all owed something to the Viking understanding of death as performance. The ritual also lived on in literature and legend. The sagas preserved its memory, transforming historical practice into literary device. Medieval chroniclers used accounts of the blood eagle to demonstrate the barbarity of pre-Christian times, the darkness from which Christ had delivered humanity. Renaissance writers rediscovered these accounts and used them to explore themes of power, violence, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. Even as the blood eagle faded from practice, its psychological insights remained relevant. The ritual had revealed fundamental truths about human nature: the capacity for extreme cruelty, the power of shared transgression to bind communities together, the way violence could be transformed into meaning through ceremony and belief. These insights would resurface throughout history, in different forms but with the same essential understanding of how terror could be weaponized. The legacy of sacred violence today, the blood eagle exists primarily as a subject of academic study and popular fascination. Television shows like Vikings have brought the ritual to modern audiences, though usually in sanitized form that emphasizes spectacle over the deeper cultural meanings. Video games and novels have appropriated the imagery while stripping away the religious context that gave it meaning for its original practitioners. But the blood eagle's true legacy lies not in its modern representations but in what it reveals about the human capacity for both cruelty and meaning-making. The Vikings who performed this ritual weren't monsters, they were human beings operating within a cultural framework that made such violence not just acceptable but sacred. Understanding this doesn't excuse their actions, but it does illuminate the dangerous flexibility of human moral reasoning. The ritual also demonstrates how violence can become institutionalized, how individual acts of cruelty can be transformed into cultural traditions that persist across generations. The blood eagle wasn't invented by a single psychopath but developed over time through the contributions of many people, each adding their own refinements to the ceremony. It became a collective creation, a shared expression of cultural values that individual Vikings inherited rather than chose. Perhaps most disturbingly, the blood eagle reveals how easily human beings can convince themselves that their cruelty serves higher purposes. The Vikings who performed this ritual weren't sadists, they were believers, convinced that their actions pleased the gods and served their community's interests. They had created a framework of meaning that transformed torture into worship, suffering into sacrifice. This transformation of violence into virtue isn't unique to Viking culture. Throughout history, human societies have found ways to sanctify cruelty, to convince themselves that their worst impulses serve noble ends. The blood eagle stands as a particularly stark example of this tendency, a reminder that the capacity for both great evil and great self-deception lies within every human culture. The archaeological evidence ensures that the blood eagle can never again be dismissed as mere legend. The bones don't lie, this ritual was real, performed by real people on real victims. But the physical evidence also reminds us that behind every historical atrocity lie individual human beings, people who suffered and died in ways that challenge our understanding of what humans can endure and inflict. Echoes in the modern world: as we stand in our modern world, surrounded by the comforts of civilization and the protections of law, it's tempting to view the blood eagle as a relic of a darker age, a practice so alien to our values that it might as well be fiction. But such comfort is dangerous. The human capacity for cruelty hasn't disappeared, it has simply been channeled into different forms, constrained by different institutions, justified by different ideologies. The 20th century alone provided ample evidence that the civilized veneer can be stripped away with terrifying speed. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the killing fields of Cambodia all demonstrated that modern humans retain the same capacity for systematic cruelty that drove the Vikings to create the blood eagle. The tools have changed, the scale has increased, but the fundamental human dynamics remain the same. What makes the blood eagle particularly relevant to our modern understanding is its combination of individual cruelty and institutional support. The ritual wasn't performed by lone psychopaths but by respected members of society, people who had the community's approval and the gods' blessing. It was violence made respectable through ceremony, cruelty transformed into virtue through belief. This transformation process continues today, though in different forms. Modern societies still find ways to justify violence, to convince themselves that their cruelty serves higher purposes. The language has changed, we speak of national security rather than divine favor, of necessary evils rather than sacred offerings, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably similar. The blood eagle also illuminates the role of witnesses in perpetuating violence. The ritual required an audience, people who would watch and remember and carry the story forward. These witnesses weren't passive observers but active participants, their presence validating the ceremony and amplifying its psychological impact. In our modern world, we are all witnesses to violence, consumers of images and stories that shape our understanding of what humans can do to each other. The digital age has made us witnesses to cruelty on an unprecedented scale. Videos of executions, images of torture, accounts of atrocities all circulate through our media systems with the same viral efficiency that once carried tales of the blood eagle across medieval Europe. We may not gather in physical amphitheaters to watch ritualized violence, but we create virtual ones every day, spaces where human suffering becomes entertainment and cruelty becomes content. The unanswered questions. Despite decades of research and analysis, fundamental questions about the blood eagle remain unanswered. How widespread was the practice? The archaeological evidence comes from scattered sites across the Viking world, but the sample size remains small. Were these isolated incidents or examples of a common practice? The sagas suggest the ritual was well known, but saga evidence is notoriously unreliable. Why did some victims receive the blood eagle while others were simply executed? The sources suggest that status and courage were factors, but the selection criteria remain unclear. Was it purely practical, a way to terrorize enemies and honor gods, or did deeper psychological needs drive the choice? The ritual's elaborate nature suggests it served purposes beyond simple execution, but those purposes remain partially hidden. How did the Vikings themselves view the ritual? Modern analysis tends to focus on the blood eagle's cruelty, but the Vikings who performed it saw it differently. To them, it was a sacred act, a way of communicating with the divine through violence. Understanding their perspective doesn't require approving of their actions, but it does demand recognizing that they operated within a completely different moral framework. The relationship between the blood eagle and other forms of Viking violence also remains unclear. Was it the extreme end of a spectrum that included more common practices, or was it qualitatively different from ordinary warfare? The ritual's elaborate nature suggests it occupied a special place in Viking culture, but its connection to everyday violence remains disputed. Perhaps most importantly, what can the blood eagle teach us about the human capacity for both cruelty and meaning-making? The ritual represents one of the most extreme examples of institutionalized violence in human history, but it also demonstrates the remarkable human ability to create meaning from suffering, to transform individual acts into collective symbols. These questions matter because they illuminate not just Viking culture but human nature itself. The blood eagle wasn't an aberration but an expression of tendencies that exist within all human societies. Understanding how those tendencies manifested in one culture might help us recognize and constrain them in our own. The final cut. As the morning mist finally lifted from that ancient fjord, as the last echoes of the ritual chanting faded into memory, the blood eagle reached its inevitable conclusion. The victim's final breath escaped through lungs that had become wings, carrying with it not just a life but a message that some humans could transform even death into art, even suffering into sacrifice. The Vikings who performed this ritual believed they were serving their gods, honoring their ancestors, and protecting their communities. They had created a framework of meaning that made the unthinkable not just possible but sacred. In doing so, they revealed something fundamental about human nature: our capacity to justify any action, to sanctify any cruelty, to transform any violence into virtue. The blood eagle stands as a monument to this capacity, a reminder carved in bone and written in blood that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we like to believe. The Vikings who gathered on those ancient shores weren't monsters from another world. They were human beings like us, operating within a different moral framework but driven by the same fundamental needs for meaning, community, and transcendence. Understanding this doesn't excuse their actions, but it does illuminate the dangerous flexibility of human moral reasoning. The same capacity for meaning-making that allows us to create art, literature, and philosophy also allows us to justify atrocity, to transform cruelty into virtue, to convince ourselves that our worst impulses serve noble ends. The archaeological evidence ensures that the blood eagle can never be dismissed as mere legend. The bones tell their story with brutal honesty. This ritual was real, performed by real people on real victims. But the physical evidence also reminds us that behind every historical atrocity lie individual human beings, people who suffered and died in ways that challenge our understanding of what humans can endure and inflict. As we close this chapter on one of history's darkest rituals, we're left with uncomfortable questions about our own capacity for both cruelty and self-deception. The Vikings who performed the blood eagle weren't uniquely evil, they were uniquely honest about the violence that lurks within human nature. They created a ritual that expressed this violence openly, transforming it into ceremony and meaning. We may have abandoned such explicit brutality, but we haven't abandoned the underlying impulses that drove it. We've simply found more subtle ways to express them, more sophisticated methods of justifying them, more complex systems for channeling them. The blood eagle reminds us that the capacity for both great evil and great self-deception lies within every human culture, including our own. The ritual's legacy isn't just historical but psychological, a window into the human soul that reveals both our darkest impulses and our remarkable ability to create meaning from suffering. Understanding this legacy doesn't require approving of the Vikings' actions, but it does demand recognizing that they were human beings like us, capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary self-justification. In the end, the blood eagle serves as both warning and mirror, a reminder of what humans can do to each other when cruelty becomes sacred, when violence becomes virtue, when the unthinkable becomes not just possible but necessary. The ritual may be dead, but the human capacity that created it lives on, waiting for the right circumstances, the right justifications, the right framework of meaning to bring it back to life. So what do you think? Which aspect of this brutal ritual reveals the most about human nature, the elaborate cruelty of the ceremony itself, the religious framework that justified it, or the way it bound communities together through shared transgression? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into history's darkest corners. Remember, the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional narratives that may be inspired by real historical events, but they're crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. The line between history and legend is often blurrier than we'd like to admit, especially when dealing with events from over 1,000 years ago. Until next time, remember that the past is never really past, it lives on in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, and the warnings we choose to heed or ignore. The blood eagle may be silent now, but its echoes still whisper through the corridors of human memory, reminding us that the capacity for both great evil and great meaning-making lies within us all.